June 1992, British newspapers got wind of a good story. A haemophiliac with HIV, it was alleged, had been recklessly infecting a succession of women lovers. His name was Roy Corns. His story was a sad illustration of how little society had changed after a decade of AIDS.
They only want their side of the story, the press do, but they don't want my side of the story because I'm made out to be the monster, of which I know I'm not, you see.
Two years earlier, a huge congregation had packed into an Indiana church for the funeral of Ryan White, another young haemophiliac who'd had to bear the brunt of irrational panic. Among the mourners was the president's wife, Barbara Bush. The rich and the famous were joining in an expression of collective remorse about the nice young boy who'd once been shunned. But people closer to the daily toll of AIDS were not convinced that public attitudes had really changed very much.
The one fight we always fight is trying to convince people that AIDS is everyone's problem. But I think it's still in most people's mind. It happens to sissies, it happens to junkies, it happens to niggers. It doesn't happen to, nice people.
And we see this over and over again, the feeling of people that this can't happen to them. It's the IV drug user, it's the black, it's the Hispanic, it's the gay man, it's the haemophiliac. And it doesn't seem to occur to people that their children are gay, their children use drugs, their children have sex with blacks and Hispanics, and that while they may be safe, they are no more than a few years removed from having this disease in their own family.
This well-to-do district of London is filled with people who, after the initial panic about AIDS, had largely come to believe that it was not really their problem. But Catherine Evans found out that it was. She was not in a high-risk group herself, but she did have a bisexual lover, and in 1989, she became HIV positive.
I don't think HIV was something that I'd really applied to my own life. I was 18, 19, and I just wanted to have fun, and I fell in love. I think that makes a huge difference. But I did try and make him use a condom. I did try and get that across to him. For about two or three months, I used to say to him, I really do think we should start using a condom.
Statistically, Catherine was unlucky. Only 600 of Britain's 8,000 AIDS cases are women, many fewer than had first been predicted. By 1993, some people were saying that the danger to heterosexuals had been exaggerated.
The rumours that are going around to do with HIV not being a heterosexual disease is rubbish. It doesn't matter whether it's come down from somebody who's been bisexual and passed it on to a woman who's been heterosexual, or a man who's bisexual and gone to sleep with another woman. It doesn't matter. It is being passed on to people who are heterosexual.
Nonetheless, there was a groundswell of opinion that the government had been crying wolf. Many doctors were frustrated.
If you cry wolf and you say, well, there's a problem and it doesn't happen, people say, well, what the hell were you talking about? If you didn't cry wolf, if you didn't say anything, people would say, why the hell didn't you say something? I mean, you will never get it right.
One family for whom the cry of wolf was not loud enough were the Corns of Birmingham. Roy Corns is an HIV-positive haemophiliac. He was diagnosed positive in 1985. 8 years on, he and his wife Linda know all the risks, but at the time, he says, he never understood that he could pass on the virus to girlfriends. 4 women may have been infected by him. Roy says he wasn't aware then of what being HIV positive really meant.
I thought at the time, oh, I'm all right, nothing wrong with me. Even though I'm HIV, I didn't see it as a life-threatening disease then. I just thought it'd be just like any other illness that I'd overcome eventually, but obviously not. But It's like I said, the government didn't publicise about HIV and AIDS during that time they told me. It wasn't not known in the country. So I just got on with my life.
His mother, Audrey, has had to bring up a large family on her own since her husband died of cancer some years ago. She had 7 sons, 6 of whom were haemophiliacs. 3 of them were infected with HIV by injection of the blood concentrate factor VIII, which they took to control bleeding in the hurly-burly of growing up.
Those boys have had to grow up with having been given a fatal disease, or a disease with a lot of uncertainty and probably fatal attached to it. They're growing up at the same time with all the other usual problems of adolescence. They desperately want to be normal, I imagine. Now, at the moment, while normal people tend not to use condoms, they're going to tend not to use condoms in order to look normal.
They told Roy, well, like when he was infected, but Roy, he was, just to say, he didn't know what it really was. He was still a young boy. I mean, he's 17. He didn't really know what it was, you see.
Her eldest son, Gary, died of AIDS in January 1993.
I see Gary go from 13 stone down to about 9 all of a sudden. And then he came home one day, like where he was living, and he said he got her AIDS, and because I still didn't know what it was. As months went by, he started to go thinner and thinner. He was just like a corpse walking around. And Roy said he would do himself in before he ever got like Gary did. But I don't know about that. This is like, this is just what he's saying, you know. Because it's a terrible death. Terrible.
The incident highlighted an underlying question facing all governments. What measures could or should be taken to protect those who weren't infected from those who were? Should blood tests be compulsory, for instance?
The thing about this epidemic is that anybody might have it. I mean, our figures in the West Midlands from our anonymous screening show that there are somewhere between 2 and 4 times as many people infected as we know about, right? Or who know themselves about it.
In those American cities like San Francisco, where AIDS was rife, the issue was much more acute. But even doctors who were concerned with the continuing spread of AIDS recognized the problems of introducing compulsory blood tests. The sick needed protection too.
The question becomes, when should you be tested, and who should know the answer to those test results? And then who do you want to know that? Do you want everyone on the block to know? Do you want your children to know? Do you want your minister to know? Do you want your employer to know? In this country, you can lose your insurance and your job and your home if it is known that you are HIV positive. Now think about that for a moment. Think about dying of a disease like AIDS with no access to health care. And so, yes, everyone should be tested. If someone's positive, they should know so that they can have access to treatment. But we don't want to, through that testing, terrify someone and also disenfranchise them from the benefits that they need to survive in society.
In Cuba, they had no such dilemma.
Cuban troops return home from the war in Angola, revolutionary heroes. But every soldier from Cuba's African wars is now tested for the AIDS virus in the world's most ambitious...
Anyone found to have HIV was quarantined indefinitely. It was a measure that was only practical under an authoritarian government. 100 miles from here, in America, they preferred to live with an element of risk.
The arrest of 29-year-old Alberto Gonzalez opened the door on America's worst nightmare. Never before had a man been put on trial for using the AIDS virus as a deadly weapon.
The charge against Gonzalez was that once he had discovered he was HIV positive, he had deliberately gone out to infect his lovers.
He said that he got his disease from a woman, and that he didn't care how many silly bitches he gave it to. His brother had it and died, and he just didn't care.
In a decision that made legal history, the jury found Gonzalez guilty of attempted murder. One of the women he'd infected was in court. Another, his former lover, Sean Hopp, was too ill to give evidence in person. Her mother spoke for her.
I hate you. That wouldn't even begin to cover what he's done to me, what he did to her. There are no words till you've been here.
In Britain, the government rejected the idea of specific laws against HIV assault.
You will always get people within society who are going to behave irresponsibly, whether it's HIV infection, whether it's drinking, whether it's murder. That doesn't mean that you turn all policies upside down on the basis of a few irresponsible people. The art of all of this is to try and steer a middle course that protects the public, but protects them by allowing a climate to be created where patients feel that they can come forward to be tested, where they're not going to be hounded, where they're not going to be locked up, where they're not going to be have sort of legal sanctions imposed upon them. And it's a delicate balance.
It's a balance that society has found it hard to get right in the last 12 years. In 1990, a Florida couple found themselves in court for using marijuana to relieve nausea caused by AIDS.
We're not a criminal. We just do it to hurt anybody. We were doing it because we wanted to survive in this world and live a little longer.
Kenny Jenks was a haemophiliac who'd infected his wife when he didn't know he was infected himself. She then became seriously ill.
The doctors were pretty upfront and they said, we don't give her a month at this rate. She went from 155 pounds down to 115 pounds, you know. And it was clear to me, I mean, she wasn't eating. She would lay on the couch and we'd keep a bucket next to her that, you know, so she could throw up in because she was so sick.
No one seemed able to help. Then a fellow AIDS sufferer gave Kenny some advice.
We got talking with this young guy there. He had nausea and all that, and he said, well, why don't you just smoke pot? Now, I'd never thought about using marijuana as a medicine, you know, therapeutically. And by that point, we were so desperate for something to work that we tried it. And it did work, and from that point on, we began using it every day.
The court was lenient, but the process took its toll. In custody, Barbara picked up another infection, and according to Kenny, it triggered a process which led to her death.
She slipped into a coma, and all of a sudden I just knew, you know, that it was time. And I put her favorite song on the radio, on the stereo, and when it was over, she passed away.
A year later, the story of how Roy Corns may have infected his girlfriends with HIV reached the newspapers in Britain. It was the start of a nightmare.
It was really traumatic. It made me really ill, especially what they put in the papers about us. I admit I took a chance, and I feel sorry for the women I have infected. But I haven't infected those hundreds who are claiming. You know, women have been phoning up, obviously to try and make money at the paper, claiming I've slept with them, which is a total load of rubbish.
Roy and his wife Linda were driven into hiding to avoid reporters.
The time like last year when they was making me out to be a monster, it was being discussed they should section me off because I'm going around deliberately infecting women. You know, I'm a happily married man. How can I go around infecting women when I'm with my wife?
I think talking about the issue in that kind of way is going to do damage. It does damage to the understanding of the public. It does damage to our ability to control the epidemic. It actually does damage to the reputation of the press, and it does damage to the individuals concerned. I mean, there is no argument that I can think of for behaving in that way, and I'm astonished that the newspapers keep doing it.
A decade of public information had done little to increase public understanding.
We don't really see many of our friends now, like, we used to be with them quite a lot, but since all the trouble, we found out who our friends were. And, like, we don't really mix with them anymore. I suppose it's just that I love him. I mean, it's HIV, but that doesn't stop you from loving somebody. I mean, I'm okay, I'm negative. But I still love Roy anyway, so it doesn't make any difference what he's got.
With Gary, I know he was only 26, but I'd like Roy to live just a bit longer than that, you know. Because he's always been my baby, Roy has.
1988, alarmed by the spread of AIDS, the Ugandan government launched a vigorous health campaign. By 1992, it was having a noticeable effect on the middle classes, but little on the poor, where the general risk of disease was highest.
We've seen people change their behavior, mainly in the middle class and upper class, because these people value their life. They have ambitions, they have plans, whereas somebody who doesn't even know whether he will be alive in a year's time, when you tell him that if you got infected by the HIV virus, you could be dead in 6 years, then it doesn't make sense. After all, he doesn't know where he'll be there.
This is typical of places where the plague has passed. All along this road there used to be houses. When their owners died, the sites were stripped bare. A detailed survey of 15 villages showed that 9% of all the adults between 13 and 44 were HIV positive, and 80% of those who died in that productive age group carried the virus.
The people who have died are mainly those who were enterprising, those that had studied, those that had made the money, those that had managed to save and were beginning to put up structures are the ones that have mostly died, which means that development rate of this whole place has been affected. Similarly so, since the parents have died, many of these children will not be going to school.
The countryside around Masaka is littered with examples. This house once belonged to a prosperous couple who were building it as the family home. First the mother died of AIDS, then the father. Before he died, the father appointed his 15-year-old son, Godfrey, head of the family. Godfrey tried to carry on the building work, but injured his back and has been lying on the floor, paralyzed, for 6 months. He and his sister, Beatrice, try to keep the family together.
So agenda okufa gye tugamba nga mugumirangawo temulima musobola okufuna kye mulya nga nange bwe mbadde mbaweereza bwe mbadde mbakolera mbalagira ne bagenda ne balima.
Godfrey was the only breadwinner in the family. He used to have a transistor radio to keep him company while the others were at school, but he had to sell it for food. Not far from here, a woman whose 4 grown children had all died was looking after 11 orphans. What Africa awaits is rescue by science. But 3,000 miles away on a lake outside Berlin, the world's top scientists sailed into the 2nd decade of AIDS in confusion and dispute. The riverboat party was a diversion from the 9th World Conference on AIDS, where few denied that the HIV virus had so far outsmarted them. One person on board reasonably satisfied with his year's research was Dr. David Ho, who'd done much to track down where the virus had originated. Back in his lab, Ho had seen an article about a 25-year-old sailor from Manchester who died from a mysterious wasting disease in 1959. Preserved tissue from the sailor's body contained HIV, which Ho was able to analyze and date.
By having that 1950 sequence, we now have an additional yardstick to measure the viral evolution.
These detailed tests showed it was exactly the same strain of HIV that hit America over 20 years later. Searching through ships' logs, they found that the sailor had often traveled to Africa. It fitted with evidence that the virus had been in Africa a long time.
Our tentative conclusion would be that the virus has been stable for several decades, and therefore this would suggest that the virus has been present for much longer, many decades or even perhaps centuries.
Ho's work disproved a whole bundle of origin theories, including one that an African monkey virus had contaminated a polio vaccination program in the late 50s, but it still left puzzling questions for the scientists. Britain's Robin Weiss was one who believed that the virus had crossed from animals into humans long before. But why, if it had been around so long, had the epidemic only surfaced in the 80s?
I do think that probably this virus has crossed host species and has come from some animal into man and then started to spread. If it happened a long time ago, perhaps 1,000 years ago, then I would say, well, HIV in man must have been restricted to some very small populations. Perhaps it wasn't so pathogenic, so disease-causing. Perhaps those groups that had it had various social taboos that prevented its rapid spread.
Also on board was Luc Montagnier, whose team in Paris had been the first to identify the AIDS virus. He was now having second thoughts. Montagnier's new theory was that HIV itself wasn't enough to cause death. That would explain why it had existed harmlessly for decades before suddenly becoming so dangerous.
The explanation could be that there is a second infectious factors which amplified the effect of the virus and made it highly pathogenic.
The debate they were having in 1993 stemmed at least in part from questions raised many years earlier by a Californian molecular biologist called Peter Duesberg. Duesberg still believes that being HIV positive is not what causes a person to get AIDS.
I wouldn't mind 1 second to be antibody positive, to be told I'm antibody positive.
Peter Duesberg produced arguments to support his belief, but couldn't get funds for further research because his program excluded HIV.
What we should really find out is what the true cause of AIDS is. And in order to do this, we have to work with the patient or go back to the clinic or back on the streets or in the bathhouses or study those who are at risk and see, in fact, what AIDS is. AIDS is not a disease entity. AIDS is a whole bag of old diseases under a new name.
Few scientists on board agreed with Duesberg, but they no longer ignored his questions. Tony Fauci was the person largely responsible for allocating American government funds for AIDS research. 10 years and millions of dollars after the discovery of the virus, he had to explain why they still couldn't demonstrate clearly how it worked, let alone provide a cure.
Just because we don't know all of the specific ways that the virus does, it doesn't mean that the virus is not primarily involved in HIV and AIDS disease. Whether there are cofactors that induce or enhance the viral effect, whether there are other infections that might also increase the body's susceptibility to getting its cells destroyed by HIV, that's all open for study and all compatible with the HIV being the cause of AIDS.
These arguments had repercussions all over the world. In Africa, governments had not only had to put up with being named as the source of the plague, but also with seeing their people abroad discriminated against. Now they found themselves being told that the problem of AIDS in Africa might be exaggerated, and that patients were really suffering from old diseases under a new name. Tuberculosis, for instance, was increasing. But it was unclear, some said, how far that could be blamed on AIDS. Local doctors like Eli Katabira said the connection was clear. Over 65% of TB patients they examined were HIV positive. And it wasn't just the chronically unhealthy who were dying.
I personally have lost a brother and probably about 10 close friends and relatives. Some of them in high positions, well-educated people who went to school together. So it's not only the poor who are affected.
Undoubtedly, there was a gap between proven records and future projections. People tracking the epidemic admitted that third world figures could be no more than educated guesses. But saying that it might not be as bad as first feared, they argued, did not justify articles suggesting it was a myth.
They just sort of put out this amorphous
kind of myth implying that there's some sort of a plot out there that some people are trying to say AIDS is a big problem in order to feather their own nest, in order to give them money for their own research. Somebody could say that about breast cancer. Somebody could say that about Alzheimer's disease and say it's all just an invention. The reason they wouldn't get away with it is because breast cancer and Alzheimer's disease are occurring in all of our communities, and people would rise up in arms and say this is absolutely absurd. In fact, they wouldn't even print it. It's so absurd. But Africa seems far away, and people can still tell stories about Africa and get them printed.
The projections for what these clinics would face in the future have inevitably varied widely. By 1992, the Harvard AIDS Institute's estimate for the number of people with HIV in Africa was anywhere between 3.5 million and 7.8 million. How quickly they would die was even more ambiguous. Ultimately, the only way to stabilize the situation was a vaccine, but the economic realities of the First World still stood in the way.
Who's going to buy vaccines for the developing world? You have to realize that the developing world's healthcare budget for many of these countries is £1, $2, $3 a year per person. That's about one dose of vaccine for all of healthcare. We don't have a great commitment to vaccines. That is, governments haven't always come in with all the power necessary to make vaccines easily available. What that does is make the private sector, which we rely on to make vaccines, relatively uninterested in vaccine development.
12 years ago, Don Francis had been a government scientist tracking the epidemic. Frustrated by lack of progress, he was now working on vaccines in the private sector.
It's a remarkably small number who are really committed to prevention. Prevention is not very sexy. Treatment is very sexy. It's very fulfilling to the individual. Prevention, on the other hand, you have to have this long vision that I think our societies lack by and large. That you have to feel really good about doing something that didn't happen.
Not on the boat was the one man many people had once expected to make the great breakthrough. Robert Gallo, who led the research team at Washington's National Institutes for Health. Back in 1984, when the Americans announced that they had discovered the cause of AIDS, Gallo had been the star, but now the occasion hung like a shadow over his life.
We've had it in the cell line for a long time.
The fact was that the French had identified the virus first, and though Gallo's lab had done vital work too, the French were furious that most credit had gone to America. A key figure in the row was Mika Popovic, whose work for Gallo had been crucial in developing a blood test. Rumors began circulating that he'd actually used a French sample. So to resolve the issue, the American and French viruses were put through detailed analysis. It revealed that the virus in Popovic's cell line was virtually identical to the French virus. The French took legal action.
Prime Minister Chirac and I are pleased to announce today.
In 1987, there was an effort to end a damaging public row. The two governments came to an agreement that proceeds from the blood test patent would be shared between France and America, and Gallo and Montagnier were declared co-discoverers of the virus. But in 1989, the Chicago Tribune reopened the row with a major investigative article into the affair. Robert Gallo found himself fending off allegations that his lab had knowingly made greater use of the French research than they had admitted, maybe even stolen their sample.
It's so preposterous that it's hard to even make a comment on. I mean, I could say I could charge somebody with murdering their grandfather.
A succession of investigations interrupted the work of Gallo's busy lab. In 1992, he and Popovic were found guilty by an internal NIH inquiry of scientific misconduct in the presentation of some of their work, but cleared of stealing the virus. But Gallo's problems weren't over. A congressional committee launched its own investigation. Much of its evidence was accumulated by a tenacious investigator called Susan Hadley, who'd recently worked at the NIH.
I believe that the evidence that's developing now is compelling, that there was at least knowing use. Whether there was some actual misappropriation is a more serious matter, and that remains to be determined.
From the start, Gallo had denied all the charges. But he'd been unable to explain why his sample appeared identical to the French one, until a clue came from an unexpected quarter. The Pasteur Institute itself. During the critical period of research, the French and Americans had exchanged viruses for information purposes. That was common practice, even with rival labs. But it's also quite common for lab viruses to float around in the air and contaminate each other. Gradually, both labs began to wonder if it was contamination which had caused the confusion.
So it was only little by little by little that the worry increases. And then for a while I wasn't sure which side the contamination had occurred on, if this was a contamination. And then the Pasteur scientists figured out what happened, that their last sample sent to us became contaminated with this virus called LAI. And then I said, okay, at last everything makes sense. Turns out to be a virus which contaminated Robin Weiss's lab, which contaminated Mario Stevenson's lab in Nebraska, which contaminated last year a lab at Duke University, which contaminated last year the lab in Frederick, Maryland, where they produce virus, and which contaminated some of Popovic's samples. A common occurrence in virology.
In November, after an appeal, Gallo and Popovic were cleared of misconduct, but the congressional investigation continues. Whichever way that goes, science has been the loser.
What is critical here is whether science's findings and a scientist's words and alleged discoveries can be relied upon. If they can't be, then science will be harmed and patients correspondingly will be harmed. That's what this is about.
Is this progress for AIDS? It doesn't change anything in history. We still developed a blood test. We've gained the data that proves the cause of AIDS. We contributed ideas and technology. We should be going on to solve the problem, to develop a vaccine, to get better therapy for people. We have a lot to do, and we were trying to do as much as we could do.
But there was much to do, no one disputed. By now, the shadow of AIDS had spread well beyond Africa. What millions of people all over the world prayed for from science was not argument, but a decisive breakthrough.
I think the reason why they sit there, they have some hope that by coming to the clinic, by being given whatever care there is to keep them alive, probably in the future things will get better. And I want them to keep that hope, because that's the hope I also have. Probably in my times, a cure will be found, and then I don't need to tell people that they are going to die. And I'll tell them they are going to live, and they believe me.
Protests in Paris as 3 health officials are convicted of allowing AIDS-contaminated blood to be given to haemophiliacs.
It was another wounding blow to the reputation of science.
There was outrage outside the court when the verdicts were known. Anger that more senior figures, including politicians, had not been in the dock.
The case had come to court because of a fatal delay in starting the HIV screening of national blood supplies. The saga showed how national and commercial interests had triumphed over the interests of patients. In 1984, the commercial arm of the Pasteur Institute had begun working closely with a government committee to produce a French blood test. One of their advisors was Luc Montagnier. still smarting from what he saw as the ungenerous behavior of the Americans. But progress at the top was too slow for doctors at the coalface. On the other side of Paris, immunologist Jacques Leibovitch was certain that untested blood was dangerous. He drove into the center of Paris to organize tests at a number of blood donor stations. The results shocked him.
To our great amazement and terror, we found 1 in 200 carried the virus, and we made the calculation that 10 or even more people transfused would be contaminated every day as of January 1985, and knowingly from us, knowingly.
Leibovitch sent his findings to the National Blood Center. By that time, a test manufactured by the American pharmaceutical company Abbott was virtually ready for general use. The problem was that the Pasteur were not ready with theirs. For 5 fatal months, French government officials found reasons to delay the use of the Abbott test. Documents produced at the trial showed how commercial considerations swayed their judgment. It was a classic case of confusing the interests of science with politics and business.
The core of the issue here is the centralized state, the concentration of power in the state. Who decides who's going to be professor, who's going to be appointed in the Pasteur industry, where they have 49% of the shares, where they have an access indirectly to the patent, where they have conflicts of interest, the first order, and where you put the France hierarchy puts power and science in the same hands with no dissent, with no dialectics, with no opposition, except by ludicrous, erratic lunatics like me.
The testing of blood in France finally started in June 1985. Overall, it's estimated that the delay caused an additional 3,000 people to become infected. At the 1993 World AIDS Conference in Berlin, Jacques Leibovitch voiced a disillusionment with science, which many scientists shared, if few expressed so frankly.
It takes 15,000 people to come together to decide they have little to offer. In fact, if you look at the faces of many people like me, they are defeated.
There were now 2 quite distinct epidemics in play. A First World one gradually reaching a plateau, and a Third World one seemingly out of control. Dr. Veracit Sititrai was a delegate from the latter. In 1988, AIDS was considered a minimal threat in Thailand, though Veracit was already skeptical.
We Asian we're not different from others. We human beings, we have the same immune system as others. I was so certain that it was like a big wave under the water, that it was spreading among heterosexual, especially prostitutes and some of the clients.
Many of the girls who arrive each day at Bangkok's Central Railway Station have come in from the country looking for work. The ones who are destined for the city's sex industry are met off the train by their pimps. Although a spot check of prostitutes in the mid-80s found no HIV, Veracit thought it couldn't last.
I took the opportunity to follow some of them to the brothel and learn the rather shocking extensiveness of how widespread casual sex is in Thailand.
By December 1991, over 1 in 5 of the prostitutes tested in Bangkok were HIV positive, and among the poorer girls in Chiang Mai, nearly half were infected.
They live, I say, a miserable life. A lot of them would like to make this occupation short and live as soon as they can, because all of them have dream of family, dream of getting married and have children and live back in their villages.
It wasn't long before the virus started showing up in ordinary family clinics. In 1989, the government distributed 19 million free condoms. The next year, a further 26 million. But the basic problem was still education. How were they to get the message across to the people who needed it most?
We produce poster and pamphlet and videotape. We produce this series called 13 Ways to Seduce Customer to Use Condom, which is totally opposite from other educational material. First step is, please use condom. I have one here and you don't have to pay for it. And condom is good for protection. If it fails, customer refuse and they go to the second step and please use condom and I put it on for you. Don't have to worry about putting it on.
And so it continued, with each offer a little more intimate and a little more enticing than the one before.
And it continued to become very openly speaking in a sexual way. For example, I lick you all over, I make you forget that you have condom on, I make you go to heaven. The 13th step, the last step, if they fail to use condom, the sex worker would say, I'm sorry, if you don't put on condom, I cannot have sex with you. I'm not angry with you, but we have to protect ourselves.
In the East, in the West, even in the conference hall, condom manufacturers are the only clear winners. After 10 years' work, it was still the best protection against AIDS that medicine could offer.
We also have condoms for prevention, and we have an educational brochure. We have an educational brochure.
We went to a wood turner's shop and we asked him to produce these wooden penises from wood that was left from furniture production.
Government education policies had become one great advertising campaign for the rubber companies. After 8 years of static sales because of the pill, the 80s boomed. In 1987, one company in Britain had seen sales go up by 25%. The country which probably needed to become the greatest consumer of condoms in the 90s was India. Although statistics amongst its teeming poor were vague, by 1992 it had probably taken over from Thailand and parts of Latin America as the place with the fastest growth rate in HIV infection. In Bombay, a young doctor called Ishwar Gilada has for some years been campaigning hard in the city's red light district. He started in 1985. Unable to persuade the authorities that the risk was serious, he issued his own unauthorized press statement.
Next day morning, I get a call from one of my very senior colleagues saying that, nonsense, what are you talking, Dr. Gilada? How much you know about AIDS? And I am in this field for 20 years and I haven't seen a single case and AIDS will not come to this country for another 10 years. I go to the administration department, they say, you are a nice man, young, enthusiastic, but what nonsense you're talking?
In 1986, Gilada set up India's first AIDS clinic, but found the establishment still strongly opposed.
Basically, there was a generation gap because the people in the government, they are of my father's age. And they would think from their own views, our religion is great, we will not get AIDS. And they used to believe that during our college life, we never had sex with somebody. But they don't see what has happened in last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in India.
For a couple of years, the number of prostitutes testing positive seemed insignificant, but the warning signs were there.
They have a very high number of or percentage of sexually transmitted diseases. 80 to 90% of them have at least one disease at any given time, and 50% of them have two diseases simultaneously.
And then the rate of HIV infection began to climb steeply. It was Thailand all over again. Set against the size of the population, over 800 million people, Gilada's operation was puny. But this, he reckoned, was where the effort should be concentrated. Eventually, he quit his job at the hospital to focus on AIDS.
Cannonball, HIV. There are 100,000 prostitutes in Bombay. Each of them get 5 clients per night. That means 500,000 men go to them every night.
और सब जान जवान लड़के हैं आजकल कई बार तो ऐसे लड़के हैं एड्स के साथ मर रहे हैं कि जिसको दाढ़ी और मूंछ भी नहीं है जैसे ये जान जवान लड़का खड़ा है.
From his own surveys, Gilada calculated that a third of the clients were college students, a third migrant workers, and a third a random mix of age and class. It was 1992 before the Indian government finally set up its own AIDS control program. By then, the projected figures were dizzying.
We estimate minimum 20 million HIV carriers by the end of the century if the government program is successful. If their actions which are planned under National AIDS Control Organization are successful. If they are unsuccessful, if their planning is bad, then by 2080 we'll have 30 to 50 million HIV carriers. 3 to 5 times the number of HIV positives in the world today. And all of them will come down heavily with clinical cases with a rate of 5% per year. So by the end of the century, we'll have 2 million HIV disease cases in the hospitals. Do we have doctors? Do we have treatment facilities? So what will happen is the government will despair. They will say, we cannot do anything.
Until 1990, Jonathan Mann was head of the World Health Organization's AIDS program. Then he resigned, unhappy with the internal politics and lack of commitment.
But our worldwide data show very clearly that the worldwide epidemic is expanding and accelerating now, at the very time when our global response has plateaued and is now even declining. So that the gap between the expanding epidemic and the plateauing or declining response, that gap is widening rapidly and dangerously, and this represents a threat to us all.
If your heart always did what a normal heart.
But back in America, as in most well-to-do countries where the plague first surfaced, the early shock is wearing off. People still grieve for the dead, but they've learned to live with the statistics.
The numbers are numbing, staggering. Not in modern history have we seen such a sweeping plague. 16 acres of a quilt, it's a fool's paradise who thinks this is under control.
I've worked in really severe worldwide epidemics for 20 years. I have never seen an agent as dangerous as HIV. There are not any infectious agents to speak of that kill essentially everyone they infect. And I think that our societies are not able to intellectually understand these long incubation period infections and respond appropriately. In the United States, we have 1 million infected people. So we say, oh, we have 1 million infected people. And when 1 million people die, we'll say, yeah, we knew 1 million people were going to die. But recognize that when that happens, that will exceed all of the war mortality in the United States of young Americans, including the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, all of it combined. And yet by that time, because it happened slowly, we'll say, oh yes, that was going to happen.
Love is all.
Michael Callan has survived with AIDS for over 10 years, a symbol of how wrong the early predictions were. But he knows as well as anyone the plague's remorseless rules.
If we always believe.
A friend of mine died yesterday, but it really was a shock. I really was shocked. I couldn't believe that she's the same age as me, beautiful looking girl, and I couldn't believe that she died.
Catherine was only declared HIV positive 3 years ago. She has time on her side. Time to hope that medicine will eventually deliver.
I'm very positive. You know, I'm going to live a long time. The girl said to me, do you have any hopes and dreams? What would you like to do in your future before you die, before you get sick? And I said, to be honest with you, I haven't even thought of that, you know. I don't think that I'm going to die. I don't like that concept.
Nor does Kenny Jenks. the haemophiliac who unwittingly gave AIDS to his wife. He came to the quilt ceremony, but not with a panel for Barbara.
My wife and I were never separated in anything, except now in death. And I can't really imagine having a panel for her and one for me when we were always so much a part of each other. I have friends that have arranged to take care of it after I'm gone. You know, I don't want a panel while I'm still here, of course, you know, because I may be here another 10 years.
What we don't have is time.